The Hells Angels biker found the little girl studying a frozen portrait, and the hidden message behind it exposed a legacy. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It's a cold, crisp winter evening when a motorcycle roars through the empty streets, the sound echoing against the bare trees. The road ahead is long, but for Jake Razor Morrison, a Hells Angels biker, the journey tonight is about more than just the miles. As the darkened landscape passes by, his thoughts are interrupted by a small flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. A light. A house. Isolated. Sitting quietly against the snow-covered ground. He slows his motorcycle and pulls into the driveway. What catches his eye is not just the house, but a girl. She's sitting by the window, studying something intently. He can tell by the way she holds herself that something about the scene is different. Something calls to him. He dismounts and walks toward the window, curiosity building in his chest. The girl, no older than 12, is staring at a portrait, frozen in the cold light of the room. The portrait is old, worn, its edges curling with age. But it's not just any portrait. It's a picture of a man, someone who looks familiar to Jake, though he can't quite place where from. The girl's delicate fingers trace the edges of the glass. She's not just admiring the picture, she's studying it. There's a purpose in her gaze. Jake's instincts, honed over years on the road, tell him something is off. His mind starts racing. Who is this girl? And why does she seem so deeply connected to this portrait? As he watches her, he can't shake the feeling that this moment is about to change everything. He knocks gently on the door. The girl looks up, startled. Her eyes meet his, and for a moment, there's a silent understanding between them. She's not afraid, but her eyes hold a secret. With a soft voice, she invites him in. "I think you need to see this," she says, her words steady but with a hint of urgency. Jake steps inside. The warmth of the house in stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The girl stands and leads him toward the portrait. She speaks again. "This portrait belonged to my grandfather. He was part of something bigger than us." Jake's curiosity grows. He steps closer to the portrait, and as he does, his eyes catch something hidden in the frame. It's a small inscription, almost invisible to the naked eye. A name, a location, and a date. This is no ordinary family heirloom. The girl's grandfather had been involved in something much deeper. Jake's fingers brush the inscription, and suddenly, it all clicks into place. The legacy behind this portrait is not just family history. It's a key to a much larger story, one that Jake never saw coming. What lies behind the legacy of this portrait is far more than what meets the eye. As Jake stood before the portrait, his mind raced with the significance of the inscription he had just uncovered. The name, location, and date seemed to pulse with a hidden meaning that connected him to something larger than he had ever imagined. The girl, still standing beside him, watched him closely, as if waiting for him to piece it all together. Her calm demeanor was at odds with the storm of thoughts swirling in Jake's head. "What's this about?" Jake finally asked, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. The girl's eyes flickered to the inscription before she spoke, her voice low. "This was my grandfather's. He always told me there was more to our family history than what was in the history books." She paused, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "I didn't understand what he meant until I found this." Jake turned his attention back to the portrait, trying to make sense of the name and the date etched into the frame. It seemed like a clue, like a map to something long hidden. But what could it lead to? The girl's grandfather had clearly been involved in something important, something Jake had never known about. He had spent years riding with the Hells Angels, living a life of chaos and rebellion. But this was a different world. The kind of world where secrets were buried, not just in the dirt, but in the very fabric of families. "Do you know where this place is?" Jake asked, his voice now more urgent. The girl nodded slowly. "I do. It's not far from here, but I don't know what's waiting for us there. My grandfather always said that whoever finds this will have to decide what to do with it." Jake could feel the gravity of her words. He had always been the type to act first and think later, but this felt different. This wasn't just a treasure hunt. This was something personal. The girl's voice shook slightly as she continued. I don't know what he meant by that. But I've seen the people who are looking for this. They're dangerous, Jake. Jake met her gaze, the weight of his own past hanging heavily in the air. I can handle danger, he said, his words simple but firm. Let's go. The girl nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face. Together, they walked out of the room and into the cold night. The air was sharp with winter's bite, but Jake felt a heat rising within him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. They climbed into his motorcycle, and Jake revved the engine, ready to follow the clues to whatever secret lay ahead. The road stretched out before them, dark and quiet, the only sound the rumble of the Harley beneath him. As they drove, the girl spoke more about her grandfather, how he had always been a mystery to her, even though she had known him her whole life. He used to say he was part of something bigger, but he never explained what that meant, she said, her voice thoughtful. And now I'm starting to think he wasn't talking about just family. He was talking about something that went deeper. Jake didn't respond immediately. He knew that feeling all too well, the idea that there were things in life that ran much deeper than the surface. He had spent decades living on the edge, running from his own past. But this was different. As they neared the location on the map, Jake's sense of unease grew. He could feel the change in the air, as if they were approaching something that was not meant to be found. The road narrowed, the trees growing thicker around them. And soon they arrived at an old, abandoned barn. The place was silent, its decaying wood and rusted hinges giving it an eerie, forgotten feel. Jake could see the faint outline of a trapdoor in the center of the barn, hidden under years of dust and dirt. This is it, the girl whispered. This is where he said it all started. Jake dismounted his bike, walking carefully toward the trapdoor. His instincts told him to be cautious, to expect the unexpected. The girl stood behind him, watching intently as he knelt down to lift the door. It creaked open with a groan, revealing a set of stairs that descended into darkness. Ready? Jake asked, looking back at her. She nodded, her face set with determination. Together, they descended into the unknown, the air growing colder as they moved deeper into the earth. The smell of must and old wood filled their noses as they reached the bottom of the stairs. The space was small, barely lit by a single, flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. But as Jake's eyes adjusted, he saw something in the far corner, an old chest, covered in dust but still intact. The girl stepped forward, her hand shaking as she reached for the chest. This is it, she said softly, her voice filled with awe. Jake stepped closer, his heart racing. This was the moment. The chest creaked open, revealing old papers, photographs, and a small, intricately carved box. The girl lifted the box carefully, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside was a key, a simple, old-fashioned key with a strange symbol etched into its surface. What does it open? Jake asked, his voice low. The girl's eyes met his, and she smiled. I think it opens the past. The key, she realized, was the final piece of the puzzle. And what lay ahead was a legacy that would change everything they knew. The cold air of the underground room wrapped around Jake and the girl like a shroud as they stared at the small, intricately carved box she held in her hands. Her fingers trembled, and her eyes were fixed on the key inside. It seemed so simple, so small, yet the weight of it felt immense. Jake stood still, his heart pounding in his chest as he wondered what exactly they had stumbled upon. What was so important about this key? What did it unlock? The girl slowly closed the box, her expression unreadable. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that fills a room with more questions than answers. I don't know what to do with it, she said softly, her voice filled with uncertainty. Jake looked at her, his mind already turning. We find out, he said, his voice steady. That's the only thing we can do. She nodded slowly, glancing back at the chest and the scattered papers surrounding them. The weight of their discovery was starting to sink in. Jake knew that this key wasn't just some relic from the past. It was part of something much bigger, something tied to her grandfather's mysterious legacy, and possibly to a hidden part of his own past that he had never fully understood. Let's get out of here, Jake suggested. We'll figure it out, one step at a time. They turned to leave the small, underground space, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. As they climbed back up the stairs, the noise of the outside world seemed distant, muffled by the walls of the barn. The girl stepped out first, followed by Jake, who paused just outside the door. The night had deepened, and the cold bite of winter was sharper than ever. He could see his breath in the air as he walked to the bike, the sound of his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The girl followed closely behind, still holding the small box. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though no one was around. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. It didn't sit right with him. The feeling gnawed at the back of his mind. As they climbed onto the bike and Jake revved the engine, the girl clutched the box to her chest, her body pressed tightly against his. The cold night air whipped by them as they sped down the winding roads. It wasn't far to the small town where she lived, but with every passing mile, Jake felt the unease grow stronger. Something was off. "We need to figure out who else is after this," Jake muttered, his voice cutting through the wind. The girl nodded, her gaze distant. "I think we already know," she replied quietly. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had been thinking the same thing, but hearing her say it out loud made it all the more real. They weren't the only ones searching for this legacy. As they reached the outskirts of town, Jake turned off the main road and pulled into a secluded spot by a cluster of trees. The house wasn't far now, but he needed a moment to gather his thoughts. "We'll head back to your place," Jake said, cutting the engine. "We need to lay low for a bit. Figure out what we're dealing with." The girl agreed, her eyes scanning the darkness around them. "I don't know who we can trust anymore," she said, her voice tight with fear. "I thought it was just a family secret, but now I know it's something much bigger. My grandfather wasn't just protecting family history. He was protecting something dangerous." Jake didn't respond right away. He was thinking about his own past, the things he had done, the things he had seen. There were times when his instincts told him to walk away, to leave everything behind, but something about this felt different. The girl's voice broke into his thoughts. "Do you think it's related to the Hells Angels?" she asked. Jake's heart skipped. He had never told her about his past, not the full story anyway. But in that moment, he realized there was no point in keeping secrets. He had to tell her everything. "I was part of the Hells Angels," he said quietly, his voice rough. "But it wasn't just about the club. There were things that were buried. I left a long time ago, but some things don't stay buried forever." The girl looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Finally, she spoke. "Do you think this key is connected to them?" Jake didn't know, but he couldn't ignore the feeling in his gut that told him it was. They couldn't stay in the open for long. He was certain that whoever was behind this, whoever was after the legacy her grandfather had protected, would stop at nothing to get it. As they pulled back onto the road, Jake's mind raced. The key, the hidden message, the legacy, it all led back to one thing: the Hells Angels. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his past, his connections to the club, might be the very thing that could help them unlock the mystery. And in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but wonder if this legacy had been waiting for him all along, pulling him back into a world he thought he had left behind. The next steps would be dangerous, but they had no choice. They had to follow the clues. They had to uncover the truth. The engine of Jake's motorcycle growled beneath him as he drove along the dark, winding roads with the girl clutching the small box in her arms. The chill of the night air seemed to pierce through his thick leather jacket, but the unease inside him was far colder than any winter night. As they approached the outskirts of the town, the weight of the journey ahead pressed heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about survival. Whoever was hunting for the key, the legacy that it unlocked, wasn't just going to give up. They were going to fight to the end. The girl shifted slightly behind him, the cold seemingly forgotten in the determination that now set her face. "Jake," she said, her voice low but firm. "I don't know if I'm ready for what's coming next." He didn't turn his head as he responded, but he could hear the fear in her voice. "None of us ever are," he muttered, his gaze fixed straight ahead. They had been traveling for hours, and the darkness of the night seemed to stretch endlessly before them. The girl had said that her grandfather had always protected the secret, but Jake knew better. Secrets like this didn't stay buried for long. They always had a way of surfacing, often when you least expected it. As they reached her house, the familiar neighborhood seemed eerily quiet, too quiet. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows on the empty sidewalks. It wasn't just the stillness that made Jake uneasy. It was the sense that something was about to happen. "Stay close," Jake warned, glancing back at the girl, who was already off the bike and walking toward her front door. He kept his hand near the holster of his gun, his instincts on high alert. The girl stepped inside the house, and Jake followed, making sure to scan every corner of the street as he passed. He wasn't taking any chances. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Inside, the familiar warmth of her home did little to ease the tension that was now gripping him. The girl set the box down on the table and began pacing nervously. "What do we do now?" she asked, looking up at Jake. He didn't respond immediately, instead walking over to the table and taking a seat across from her. The weight of the key, the box, the message, all of it was coming to a head, and he could feel it. The girl was right. They weren't ready for what lay ahead. But they had no choice but to face it. "We figure out what this legacy means," Jake said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "And we figure out who's coming after it. Whoever they are, they're not going to stop." The girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear but also with something else, determination. "I think I know who's after us," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" he asked, leaning forward. "It's not just random people," she replied, her gaze dropping to the box. "It's my uncle. He's been looking for this key for years. He always thought I knew where it was, but I never understood what it was. Now I do, and he'll do anything to get it." The mention of her uncle sent a shiver down Jake's spine. He had dealt with plenty of dangerous people in his time, but family members who would betray each other for power or money, that was a different kind of threat. "Where is he now?" Jake asked. "He's always been involved with shady people. I think he's in with the wrong crowd. I don't know where he is now, but I know he's been watching me." Her voice trembled, and Jake could see the fear in her eyes. "He's not the only one," Jake muttered. "There are others. I can feel it." As the girl stood there, looking at him with fear and uncertainty, Jake knew they had to act fast. They couldn't let her uncle, or anyone else, get their hands on the key. But how could they protect it when they didn't even fully understand what it unlocked? "We need to get to the bottom of this," Jake said, standing up. "We can't stay here. Not tonight. It's too dangerous." The girl hesitated, but then nodded. "Where do we go?" she asked. Jake glanced at the box and the key inside it. He knew they had to follow the clues, every last one of them, but it wasn't going to be easy. The girl's uncle wasn't the only danger they faced. There was a bigger picture here, something far more dangerous than either of them could have imagined. "I think we need to find the place the key opens," Jake said, his mind racing with possibilities. "If we find that, maybe we can understand everything. We have to get to the heart of this legacy, and we can't wait any longer." The girl looked at him, uncertainty in her eyes, but there was also a spark of hope. "What do we do first?" she asked. Jake didn't hesitate. "We leave now. We head to the place on the map. I don't care what's waiting for us. We'll face it head on." But we move fast. As they prepared to leave the house, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the storm they were about to enter was much bigger than anything they had faced before. The key, the hidden legacy, it was all coming to a head, and they were just at the beginning of something much darker than they had ever expected. As Jake and the girl left her house, the night air seemed colder, the tension thicker. Jake's mind was still racing as they sped down the road. The motorcycle's engine roared beneath them, the dark landscape blurring by as they made their way toward the place on the map. The girl, still clutching the box with the key, remained silent, her thoughts clearly far away. Jake could tell she was struggling to process everything: her grandfather's legacy, the danger that was closing in on them, and the growing weight of the mystery that had just unfolded. He wasn't sure if she was more afraid of what was to come or of what they might find at the end of this road. "Do you think this place will have the answers?" she asked quietly, breaking the silence. Jake glanced over at her, his grip on the handlebars steady. "It better," he muttered. "If this key leads us anywhere, it's the only chance we have to understand what your grandfather was protecting. But we've got to move fast. We don't know who's out there waiting for us." The girl nodded but said nothing more. Jake could feel her anxiety, but there was something else there, too: determination. She was ready for whatever came next, even if it meant facing the unknown. They reached a stretch of road that wound through thick woods, the trees casting long shadows under the moonlight. The headlights of Jake's bike illuminated the path ahead, but everything else felt eerily still. The sound of the engine was the only thing breaking the silence. As they approached a clearing, Jake slowed down. "This is it," the girl whispered, her voice filled with awe. Ahead of them, tucked in the distance between the trees, was an old, abandoned mansion. It stood in stark contrast to the peaceful surroundings, its decaying stone walls and broken windows giving off an air of mystery and neglect. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he parked the bike. There was something about this place, something ancient and unsettling. The mansion didn't just look abandoned. It felt like it had been waiting for them. The girl dismounted, her steps hesitant as she moved toward the entrance. Jake followed closely behind, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. The air felt thick with history, as if the very ground beneath them had been soaked in secrets. They walked through the crumbling doorway, and the creak of the door echoed in the stillness. Inside, the mansion was dark and cold, with only the faintest light filtering through the broken windows. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the dim light like ghosts of the past. The walls were lined with old portraits, their faces faded and obscured by years of neglect. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about this place," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said it was where it all began, but I never knew why." Jake could feel the weight of her words as they moved deeper into the mansion. They reached a grand staircase, its wooden steps creaking beneath their feet. At the top of the stairs, they found a large, ornate door. It was unlike anything Jake had seen before. Its surface was covered in intricate carvings, and the keyhole seemed to beckon them. The girl stepped forward, her fingers trembling as she reached into her pocket and pulled out the small key. She held it up, her breath catching as she inserted it into the lock. There was a faint click, and the door creaked open. Inside was a large, dimly lit room, filled with ancient bookshelves and dusty furniture. In the center of the room stood a large stone pedestal, and atop it, a small chest. The girl's eyes widened in disbelief as she approached the chest, her steps slow and cautious. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake followed closely behind, his heart pounding in his chest. They had made it. But what would they find inside? The girl carefully opened the chest, her hands shaking. Inside, there were papers, old photographs, and a strange, weathered book. She lifted the book out, dusting it off before she flipped it open. The pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams, and Jake could feel the weight of their meaning, even though he didn't understand them. "What is this?" the girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake leaned in, his brow furrowing as he examined the pages. "I don't know," he said, his voice tense. "But it looks like your grandfather was part of something bigger, something connected to this legacy." The girl's hands shook as she turned the pages, each one revealing more mysteries than the last. There were names, dates, and strange rituals, things that Jake couldn't begin to comprehend. But the more he looked, the more he felt like they were standing on the edge of something enormous, something that could change everything. "We need to get this back to the bike," Jake said, his voice urgent. "We've uncovered something, but we don't know what it means yet. And I don't trust that we're alone in here." The girl nodded, quickly gathering the papers and the book. As they turned to leave, a noise echoed from upstairs, footsteps, heavy and deliberate. Jake's instincts kicked in. They weren't alone. Someone was coming for them. He grabbed the girl's arm and pulled her toward the door. They had to move fast. Whoever else was here, they weren't just after the legacy. They were after them. The air grew colder as they rushed through the dark hallways, the sound of footsteps behind them growing louder. Jake didn't dare look back. He couldn't let anything slow them down. The mansion was alive with secrets, and now, those secrets were hunting them. They had to escape, but Jake knew they were far from safe. The truth they had uncovered was only the beginning of something far more dangerous, and it was coming for them. The mansion felt like a maze as Jake and the girl rushed through its dark hallways, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The noise from upstairs grew louder, more frantic. Someone was getting closer, and they couldn't afford to be caught. Jake's heart raced, but his mind was clear. He had to get them out of here, and fast. "We need to move," he said, grabbing the girl's arm. She nodded, her face pale with fear but determined. The book she had found earlier was tucked tightly under her arm, the weight of it pressing into her side. They reached the main door, but just as they were about to push it open, a figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden in the shadows. Jake's pulse quickened. He had expected trouble, but this was a whole new level. The man stepped forward, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and cold. The girl froze, but Jake didn't hesitate. He knew that whatever this man wanted, they couldn't give it to him. Not now. Not with the key and the book in their possession. "Stay behind me," Jake ordered, positioning himself between the girl and the man. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The man's eyes narrowed as he sized Jake up. "I don't want to hurt you," the man said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But I will if I have to." Jake wasn't buying it. He had been in enough fights to know when someone was bluffing and when they weren't. This man wasn't bluffing. The girl stepped forward, her voice shaking but steady. "We're not giving it to you," she said, clutching the book tighter. The man's gaze flickered to the book and then back to her. "You don't understand," he said, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Jake's hand moved to the knife at his waist, but he didn't draw it. "Not yet. You've got 5 seconds to explain what you want before I make it clear that you're not." "Welcome here," Jake growled. The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "5 seconds is all I need," he replied. And before Jake could react, the man lunged at them, his speed and strength catching Jake off guard. The girl screamed as she backed away, but Jake was already moving. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it and forcing him to the ground. The fight was quick, brutal. Jake had spent years in the Hells Angels, facing off with enemies who thought they could intimidate him. This man, whoever he was, didn't stand a chance. Within moments, Jake had the upper hand, pinning the man's arm behind his back. "I don't want to hurt you," Jake said again, his voice cold. "But if you keep this up, I won't have a choice." The man grunted, struggling against Jake's hold, but he wasn't going anywhere. "You don't know what you're dealing with," the man spat. "You're playing with fire." Jake pressed harder, making the man wince in pain. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Jake replied. "And I don't care." He could feel the girl watching him, her breath coming in short gasps as she took a step back. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the unspoken danger that hung between them. Finally, the man stopped struggling, his body going slack beneath Jake's grip. "You'll regret this," he muttered. "We all will." Jake stood up, keeping his eyes on the man. He didn't trust him, didn't trust anyone involved in whatever this was. But he knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to give up without a fight. The man pushed himself to his feet, his eyes still burning with hatred. "You'll find out soon enough," he said. "You'll regret crossing the wrong people." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jake and the girl standing in the dark, the air still charged with the remnants of their confrontation. Jake watched him go, his mind racing. This was bigger than they had realized. Whatever the man had been involved in, it wasn't over yet. And now, they were in deeper than ever. The girl was shaking, but Jake could see the fire in her eyes. She wasn't backing down. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice firm. "We can't stay in this place. We need answers, and we need them fast." The girl nodded, her grip tightening on the book. "But where do we go?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. Jake didn't have an answer yet. He didn't know what they were up against, but he knew they had to keep moving. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't let the people chasing them catch up. "We find a safe place. And then we figure out who's really behind this," Jake said, his voice steady. "But we don't stop until we get to the bottom of this." Together, they walked out of the mansion, the weight of their discovery and the danger that followed them settling in. The storm was far from over, but Jake was ready for whatever came next. They had come this far, and they weren't going to back down now. As Jake and the girl made their way down the long, deserted road, the chill of the night air seemed to freeze every thought in Jake's mind. The mansion they had just left felt like a distant nightmare, and yet the urgency to uncover the truth was still there, pressing on him. The girl was still clutching the book with the strange symbols, and Jake could see the fear and determination mixed in her eyes. She had come this far with him, and Jake knew there was no turning back. They were in this together now, whether they liked it or not. "Where do we go now?" the girl asked quietly, her voice trembling as they sped through the night. Jake didn't have a concrete answer, but the feeling in his gut told him they needed to keep moving, to get out of the open. "I don't know yet, but we can't stay in one place for too long," he said, his grip tightening on the handlebars. We need to find out more about that book and the key. Someone else is definitely looking for it, and they won't stop until they get it. The girl nodded, her grip on the book tightening as though she was trying to protect it from the world around them. But who are they? Why do they want it so badly, she asked. Jake wasn't sure if he had an answer for her. He'd seen enough in his time with the Hells Angels to know that people did terrible things for power and money, but this was different. The girl's grandfather had kept this legacy hidden for a reason. He had protected it, knowing the danger it held. But now, it was out in the open, and the people who wanted it were getting closer. Jake shook his head, his mind racing. I don't know, but I'm guessing it's connected to something bigger. Your grandfather wasn't just hiding a key in a book. He was hiding a piece of history. Something that could change everything. They drove for hours, the road stretching endlessly in front of them. The night was still, with no sign of life other than the hum of the motorcycle. Jake's thoughts kept drifting back to the mansion. It felt like a place out of time, as though it was meant to be a tomb for secrets long buried. But now those secrets were waking up, and they were going to be dangerous. The girl broke his thoughts. Jake, do you think they'll find us? Do you think they'll come after us? Her voice was small, fragile. Jake could feel the fear in her words, and for a moment, he didn't know how to answer. He had spent years running from his past, from people who wanted to hurt him. He had always known how to survive. But this was different. We'll make sure they don't, Jake said finally, his voice low but firm. We'll keep moving, keep one step ahead. And when we figure out what this is really about, we'll deal with it. The girl didn't respond, but Jake could feel her eyes on him. They weren't out of danger yet, and the road ahead was as uncertain as ever. They finally stopped at a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of a nearby town. Jake parked the bike, and the girl hesitated before getting off. This place seems off, she said, glancing around. Jake nodded. Yeah, it's not much, but it'll do for the night. We can lay low for a bit and figure out our next move. The girl looked uncertain but nodded, following Jake as they entered the motel. The manager, a weathered man with a thick beard, didn't even look up when they walked in. Jake paid for the room and led the girl down the narrow hallway to their door. Inside, the room was dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a night of rest. As soon as they were inside, the girl sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she opened the book again. I have to figure this out, she said quietly, her eyes scanning the pages. I have to know what this means. Jake sat down beside her, his eyes fixed on the pages. The symbols, the strange writing, it was all so much to process. He had seen many things in his life, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival or staying one step ahead. This was about something much bigger than either of them. We'll figure it out, Jake said softly. Together. The girl looked up at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. For the first time, she seemed to relax, if only slightly. But just as the tension in the room seemed to ease, there was a knock at the door. Jake's instincts flared immediately. He motioned for the girl to stay quiet as he stood and walked to the door, his hand going to the handle. He didn't open it. Not yet. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Who is it? Jake called, his voice steady, hiding the tension beneath it. There was a pause, and then a voice replied, low and familiar. Jake, open the door. We need to talk. It was the voice of a man he had hoped to never hear again. It was the voice of someone from his past. The girl looked up at him, confusion and fear in her eyes. Jake's heart sank. He knew this voice, and it meant they weren't as safe as they thought. The past had caught up with them. The man outside the door wasn't someone who would let them go without answers. And the girl's grandfather's legacy? It was about to change everything. The knock at the door sent a jolt through Jake. His heart pounded in his chest as the man's voice echoed in his mind. It was someone he knew, someone from his past he thought he'd never have to face again. The girl looked up at him, confusion and fear spreading across her face. She was still clutching the book, the weight of it pressing heavily between them. Jake didn't answer the door immediately. His instincts told him to be cautious. Whoever was out there didn't come to talk. They came for something, and Jake wasn't going to let them take it. Not without a fight. He glanced back at the girl. Stay behind me, he whispered. She nodded, but her eyes were wide with worry. Jake reached for the knife tucked into his waistband, his fingers brushing the cold steel. His mind raced, trying to anticipate what was coming next. He could hear the man's footsteps outside, steady and deliberate. The guy wasn't going anywhere. The question was, how would Jake handle it? He wasn't about to open the door, not yet. Instead, he crept to the window, pulling back the curtain just slightly to get a better look. His breath caught as he saw the man standing in the dim light just outside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket, but his face was partially obscured by the shadows. Jake's instincts flared. This was no ordinary visitor. This was someone who knew him. Someone who was coming for the key and the book. Jake turned back to the girl. "Get ready," he said, his voice low and steady. "We might have company." She looked at him, fear still written all over her face. But there was also something else there now. Determination. She wasn't going to run. Jake didn't blame her. They were in this together. The knock came again, more urgent this time. "Jake, open the door. I know you're in there." The voice called, louder now, with a tinge of irritation. Jake's fingers tightened around the knife. "Who is it?" he called back, his voice steady. The man outside paused, then spoke again, his tone colder now. "You know who it is. Open up, or I'll come in." Jake's mind raced. He could feel the pressure building. He didn't want to give this man an inch. If they opened the door now, they might lose their advantage. They didn't have much of a plan, but Jake was sure of one thing. They couldn't let anyone else get their hands on the book or the key. He glanced at the girl again, who was now standing up and moving closer. She was ready. Jake nodded at her and turned back to the door, stepping into position. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he knew it was going to be fast. He took a deep breath and opened the door slowly, just enough to see the man standing outside. As soon as the door cracked open, the man stepped forward, his face now visible. It was a face Jake knew too well. A former associate, someone who had been tangled up in the Hells Angels network years ago. But Jake hadn't seen him in a long time. "It's been a while," Jake said, his voice calm but filled with a dangerous edge. The man smirked, his eyes scanning the room behind Jake. "Not long enough," he replied. "I know you've got it. Hand it over." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He knew what the man was talking about. The book, the key. Everything they had been through, all the clues they had uncovered, it all came down to this moment. Jake didn't flinch. "What makes you think I'm giving it to you?" he asked, his hand tightening on the knife. The man's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Because you don't have a choice," he said, his voice low. "The key, the book, they're not yours to keep. Hand them over, or I'll take them from you." The air seemed to grow thicker, the tension between them almost palpable. Jake could feel his heart racing, his instincts on high alert. This man wasn't playing games. He wanted something, and Jake wasn't about to give it to him. "I'm not giving you anything," Jake said, his voice hardening. The man's eyes narrowed, and Jake could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. Without warning, the man lunged forward, his hand reaching for the door. Jake acted quickly, slamming the door shut with all his strength, trapping the man's arm between the door and the frame. The man let out a roar of pain, but didn't back off. Jake yanked the door open again, only to find the man charging at him, a look of rage in his eyes. In that instant, everything seemed to happen at once. Jake pushed the man back, forcing him away from the door. The girl stepped back, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't make a sound. Jake's breath came in quick bursts as he wrestled with the man, his knife flashing in the dim light. The man was strong, but Jake had the advantage of experience. He had fought worse battles than this. But the man wasn't alone. As Jake shoved him back again, a second figure emerged from the shadows behind him. This time, Jake didn't hesitate. He had to act quickly. He kicked the first man in the chest, knocking him to the ground, before spinning around to face the new threat. The second man was faster, moving in close with a knife of his own. Jake barely had time to react, but he managed to block the strike, his own knife coming down in a swift arc. The second man staggered back, blood dripping from the wound in his side. The first man was already back on his feet, and now both of them were closing in. Jake's mind was racing. There was no way they could win this fight, not against two men who were clearly here for one reason: to take what Jake and the girl had found. They had to get out. Jake glanced at the girl, who was standing at the back of the room, frozen in fear. He had to protect her. "Run!" Jake shouted, pushing the girl toward the door. "Get out of here. Now!" The girl hesitated for a moment, but Jake's voice snapped her out of it. She ran for the door, and Jake followed close behind. The fight was far from over, but for now, survival was the only thing that mattered. The sounds of running feet echoed down the narrow hallways as Jake and the girl sprinted through the dim motel, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had no time to look back, only forward, toward the exit, toward freedom. Jake could hear the angry shouts from the men behind them, their voices growing louder, but he didn't dare stop to fight. There was no way they could win this battle, not with 2-on-1. They had to escape. They had to get away. This way, Jake shouted to the girl as they neared the back door. She was right behind him, her face pale but determined. Jake could feel the tension in her every step, but there was something else too, an unspoken trust, a bond that had formed between them in the chaos of the past few hours. As they reached the back door, Jake pushed it open with force, the cold air rushing in to meet them. They didn't stop. They ran out into the parking lot, and Jake's bike was still there, right where they had left it. His heart skipped a beat. They had a chance. They just had to get on the bike and get out of there before the men caught up. He threw the keys to the girl. "Get on," he shouted. She grabbed them, her hands shaking slightly as she climbed onto the bike behind him. Jake didn't wait for her to settle in before starting the engine. The motorcycle roared to life, its sound filling the quiet night. Jake hit the throttle, and the bike shot forward, speeding out of the parking lot and onto the open road. The girl clung to him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. Jake didn't dare look back. He focused on the road ahead, the wind in his face, and the adrenaline coursing through his veins. But the danger wasn't over yet. He knew they couldn't outrun the men forever. They were too close now. "We need to get off the road," Jake said, his voice sharp with urgency. "They'll be looking for us on the highways. We have to take the back roads." The girl didn't say anything, but she nodded, her face set with determination. She knew he was right. They couldn't afford to make another mistake. They had to be smart. Jake turned the bike onto a dirt road that cut through the woods, the sound of the tires crunching against the gravel, the only noise breaking the stillness of the night. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows across the path. Jake pushed the bike harder, the engine roaring as they raced through the darkness. They had to stay ahead. They had to stay alive. The road was narrow and winding, but Jake knew it well. He had ridden these back roads before, long ago, when he was running from the past. But tonight, he was running for something else. Tonight, he was running for the girl beside him, for the legacy they had uncovered, for the secrets they still didn't understand. As they sped through the woods, Jake could feel the weight of the book and the key between them. He knew they were more than just relics. They were a doorway to something much bigger, and whoever was after them knew it too. They weren't just after a piece of history. They were after control. Jake had seen it before, the way power could corrupt. He had seen what happened when someone wanted something so badly that they would destroy everything in their path to get it. He wouldn't let that happen to her. Not on his watch. He glanced over his shoulder, just for a second, to check if they were being followed. The darkness behind them seemed endless, but Jake knew it wasn't. They would catch up. They always did. "How much farther?" the girl asked, her voice cutting through the rush of wind. Jake didn't answer immediately. He focused on the road ahead, his eyes scanning the darkened woods. "Not far," he said finally, though he wasn't sure if it was true. He had no idea how far they had gone or how much further they could go before they ran out of options. But he knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stop now. The road ahead was their only chance. "Hang on," Jake said, leaning into a sharp curve. The bike wobbled slightly, but Jake steadied it, feeling the familiar grip of the handlebars beneath his hands. He pushed harder on the throttle, urging the bike to go faster, to outrun whatever danger was chasing them. As the trees blurred past them, the girl held on tighter, her breath quick and shallow against his back. "Are we going to make it?" she asked, the fear creeping back into her voice. Jake didn't answer right away. He didn't have a good answer. But he wasn't about to tell her that. He wasn't about to let her lose hope. "We will," he said finally, his voice firm. "We're not giving up. Not now." They sped down the road, the wind whipping past them like a storm, the night closing in around them. Jake could feel the pressure mounting, but he refused to slow down. He wouldn't stop until they were safe, until they knew the truth, whatever the cost. And just when it seemed like they might make it, a flash of headlights appeared in the distance. They were back on the road, and the chase was far from over. The headlights of the car grew brighter in the distance, flashing through the trees like a warning. Jake's heart raced, his grip on the bike's handlebars tightening. The girl's arms were wrapped around him, her face pressed against his back, her breath coming in quick bursts. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. They were being followed. The car's engine roared louder as it closed the distance, and Jake pushed the throttle down harder. The bike surged forward, the wind howling in his ears, but no matter how fast they went, the car kept gaining on them. "Hold on," Jake shouted over his shoulder to the girl. She squeezed him tighter, her nails digging into his jacket, but she didn't say a word. She didn't need to. They were in this together. The road ahead was nothing but twists and turns, the trees blocking out most of the light from the moon. Jake had ridden these back roads before, but tonight they felt like a maze. Every curve seemed to pull them deeper into the woods, further away from safety, but still, the car was closing in. It wasn't just a car anymore. Jake could see the outline of a large SUV behind them now, the headlights blinding, the engine roaring like an animal in pursuit. Whoever was driving it wasn't slowing down. They wanted something, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. Jake's mind raced. He had no plan. He had no idea how to shake them. They couldn't outrun the car forever. The bike's engine was powerful, but the SUV was built for speed and pursuit. They had no time to lose. Jake's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and that's when he saw it, the glow of more headlights. The first car had been joined by another. The chase had just gotten worse. "They've got backup," Jake muttered under his breath. The girl's voice came through, sharp with panic. "What do we do?" Jake gritted his teeth. He had to think fast. "We need to lose them. I know a place up ahead, a clearing. We can't outrun them, but we can hide." He didn't wait for her reply. He took a sharp left turn, the bike screeching as the tires slid on the gravel. The trees closed in on them, the road narrowing as they veered off the path. The SUV behind them didn't hesitate. It followed them into the woods, the headlights flashing through the trees like two hunting wolves. The girl gasped as the bike jolted over rocks and branches, but Jake didn't let up. He could hear the SUV's engine just behind them, too close for comfort. It was a matter of seconds before they would be caught. "This is it," Jake said, more to himself than to her, as he pushed the bike harder. Up ahead, he could see the clearing. There was a narrow path through the trees, and beyond that, a small hill that led to a dead end. Perfect for hiding. Jake made the decision in an instant. He veered left again, this time going off-road entirely, plowing through the underbrush. The girl yelped, holding on tighter as the bike bounced over the uneven terrain. The SUV didn't hesitate either, but it was slower, struggling to keep up with the bike as it cut through the woods. The clearing was just ahead. They had to make it. Jake's eyes were fixed on the path ahead as they reached the edge of the clearing. He slammed on the brakes, spinning the bike around just as the SUV skidded into the open space. He had only moments. He turned off the headlights and quickly pushed the bike behind a large rock at the edge of the clearing, out of view. The girl slid off the bike, her legs shaky but steady. She didn't say anything, just followed Jake as he crouched low, both of them watching the SUV. It screeched to a halt in the center of the clearing. The headlights still burned brightly, casting long shadows across the trees. The men in the SUV didn't get out right away. They were scanning the area, their eyes searching the woods for any sign of movement. Jake held his breath, every muscle tense, as he and the girl stayed hidden behind the rock. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as the seconds ticked by. They couldn't make a sound. If they were caught, there was no telling what would happen. The SUV's engine revved loudly, breaking the silence. But still, the men didn't get out. They were waiting. Jake's mind raced. He could hear the rustle of the leaves and the occasional snap of a twig as the men scanned the area. He didn't know how much longer they could stay hidden. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the men in the SUV seemed to decide that they were wasting time. The engine revved again, and the SUV turned around, speeding off in the direction they had come. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. They were safe. For now. He stood up slowly, his knees aching from crouching for so long. The girl stood beside him, still tense, but visibly relieved. "Are they gone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't answer immediately. He listened for the sound of the SUV, but the only noise now was the wind rustling through the trees. He nodded. "For now, but they'll be back. We have to keep moving." The girl looked at him, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty, but also a hint of determination. "What do we do next?" she asked. Jake met her gaze, his jaw set in a grim line. We get out of here. We find out who's behind this, and we finish what we started. They both knew that this wasn't over. The danger was far from gone, but Jake wasn't about to stop. They had come too far, and now there was no turning back. The night stretched on as Jake and the girl pushed forward, their hearts still racing from the close call with the men in the SUV. They couldn't stay hidden forever, but they had to figure out where to go next. The clearing they had taken refuge in had been their best chance to evade their pursuers, but Jake knew they couldn't risk staying in one place too long. They had to keep moving, keep ahead of whoever was hunting them. The girl walked beside him, her steps slow but determined. The key and the book were heavy in her hands, a reminder of everything that was at stake. They had no answers yet, only more questions. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "We find the people behind this," he said, his voice low and steady. "And we get to the bottom of it." The girl looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to read him. She didn't speak, but Jake could feel her uncertainty. She had trusted him up until this point, but the danger was getting real. He could see it in her eyes. "You're not alone in this," Jake said, his voice softening. "We're in this together. I won't let anything happen to you." The girl nodded, but Jake could see the worry still there. She wasn't so sure anymore. They were both in over their heads, and the stakes were higher than either of them had imagined. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound their footsteps crunching on the gravel. The night felt heavier now, like the weight of the world was pressing down on them. Jake knew they couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, they would have to face whoever was behind this, and they needed answers. They needed to know what the legacy was all about, why it was so important, and why people were willing to kill to get their hands on it. After what felt like hours of walking, they finally reached a small town. The streets were empty, the lights dim, but there was something comforting about the quiet. They stopped in front of an old diner, the neon sign flickering in the night. Jake looked at the girl. "We need to lay low for a while," he said. "We'll figure out our next move." The girl nodded again, but she didn't seem convinced. She still had that look in her eyes, the one that told Jake she was afraid. They stepped inside the diner, the warm air a welcome relief from the cold night. The place was small, with only a few people scattered around the tables. A waitress looked up from behind the counter as they walked in. "You two look like you've been running for a while," she said, her voice friendly but curious. Jake glanced at the girl, then back at the waitress. "You could say that," he replied, his voice neutral. The waitress smiled sympathetically. "You're safe here," she said. "At least for a while. But if you're looking to stay out of sight, you might want to keep moving soon." Jake nodded, but he didn't feel safe. Not yet. Not until they had answers. They sat at a small booth by the window, and the waitress brought them a pot of coffee. The girl stared into her cup, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. Jake watched her for a moment, then leaned forward. "We're going to get through this," he said quietly. "We'll find out who's behind this, and we'll make sure they don't hurt you." The girl didn't look up, but she gave a small nod. "I'm just tired of running," she said, her voice soft. "I don't want to be scared anymore." Jake understood. He had spent years running, too, trying to outrun the past. But sometimes, running wasn't enough. Sometimes, you had to turn and face whatever was chasing you. He wasn't sure how they were going to do it, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. They had to keep going. They had to find out what this legacy was all about, and they had to make sure it stayed buried, far from the hands of the people who were after it. As they sat in silence, the diner's door opened, and Jake's eyes snapped to the entrance. He didn't know why, but his instincts told him something wasn't right. The man who walked in was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a leather jacket. He didn't seem to notice Jake and the girl right away, but Jake's heart skipped a beat. There was something about the man's presence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The man scanned the room, his gaze landing on them for just a second. Then he walked to the counter and ordered a coffee. Jake didn't move, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Who is he?" the girl asked quietly, her eyes following the man's movements. Jake didn't know, but he had a sinking feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. They couldn't stay here for long, not with this guy in the same place. He glanced at the girl, then back at the man. "We need to go," Jake said, his voice low. The girl looked at him, her eyes wide. "What's wrong?" Jake stood up, his hand on the girl's arm. "That guy is trouble. We don't have time to find out what he wants." They stood quickly, and Jake led the girl toward the back door. As they stepped outside, the cold air hit them like a slap. Jake glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the diner's windows. He couldn't see the man anymore, but he didn't feel safe. Not with this new threat hanging over them. "We have to get back on the road," Jake said, his voice firm. The girl didn't argue. She just nodded, and together, they headed back toward the motorcycle. They weren't out of danger yet, but Jake was determined. They were going to figure this out, no matter what. He wouldn't stop until the legacy was buried once and for all. The cold wind bit at their faces as Jake and the girl sped down the road, the engine of the motorcycle roaring beneath them. The danger they had just escaped was still fresh in Jake's mind, but the adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving only a heavy sense of urgency. The man from the diner had been too close for comfort, and Jake was certain that the people chasing them weren't far behind. He could feel it in his bones, that they were being hunted. The road ahead seemed endless, the darkness stretching out before them, but Jake couldn't afford to think too far ahead. He needed a plan, and fast. He glanced over his shoulder, making sure they weren't being followed. The road behind them was empty for now, but Jake knew that silence meant nothing. The girl's grip on him tightened, and Jake could feel her fear, though she was trying her best to hide it. She had been through so much in such a short time, and Jake could only imagine what was going through her mind. "We need to find somewhere safe," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "Somewhere to lay low for a while and figure out what we're dealing with." The girl nodded, though she didn't speak. She was still clutching the book and key, her knuckles white from the grip. Jake knew how much this all meant to her. Her grandfather's legacy, the secrets hidden for so long, and now they were tangled up in it all. But there was no going back. They were already too deep. "I know a place," Jake said, turning the bike down a narrow side road. "It's an old cabin in the woods. We can keep low there until we figure things out." The girl didn't question him. She just held on tighter as they turned onto the dirt road, the tires kicking up loose gravel behind them. The trees around them thickened, the forest swallowing them up as the road twisted and turned, leading them further away from the town. The ride felt like it lasted hours, though Jake knew it was only a few minutes before they reached the cabin. When they arrived, the place looked exactly like Jake remembered, old, weathered, and abandoned, but secure. He parked the bike near the door and turned off the engine. The girl stepped off the bike, looking up at the cabin with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. "Are we safe here?" she asked, her voice quiet. Jake glanced around. The cabin had been his refuge before, a place to disappear when he needed to get away from the world. He hoped it would still be enough. "For now, yeah," he said, his voice steady. "We'll stay here for the night, lay low, and figure out our next move." He motioned for her to follow him, and they stepped inside the cabin. The air inside was cold, but it was better than the biting wind outside. The wooden floor creaked beneath their feet as they walked through the dimly lit space. Jake quickly went to the fireplace and started a fire, the crackling of the wood the only sound breaking the silence. The girl sat down at the table, staring at the book in her hands. She didn't say anything for a while, just running her fingers over the pages, her expression distant. Jake watched her, his mind still racing with everything that had happened. He had never been good at playing the hero, but this felt different. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about keeping her safe, protecting what they had uncovered. He had to find answers. He had to find out who was behind this, and why they were so determined to get their hands on the book and key. He couldn't let anyone hurt her. "I'll figure out what to do with this," Jake said, breaking the silence. He nodded toward the book in her hands. "But for now, we need to stay quiet, keep our heads down. We'll have time to figure it all out." The girl looked up at him, her face serious. "What if we can't? What if they find us again?" Jake paused, meeting her gaze. He didn't have an answer for her. The truth was, he didn't know what would happen next. But he wasn't going to let her face it alone. "I'll keep you safe," Jake said, his voice steady. "We'll make it through this." The girl nodded slowly, though doubt still lingered in her eyes. She stood up, walking over to the window and looking out at the dark woods beyond. Jake could see the weight of everything pressing down on her. He couldn't imagine what it was. Like for her, having her world turned upside down in such a short time. But they were both in this together now. And no matter what came next, Jake wouldn't back down. He would keep his promise. As the fire crackled in the fireplace, Jake sat down at the table, his thoughts running in 1,000 different directions. The mystery of the book and the key was just beginning to unravel, but Jake knew the people behind this wouldn't stop until they had everything. And they wouldn't hesitate to hurt anyone who got in their way. He had to stay ahead of them. He had to stay one step ahead if they were going to survive this. The girl came back to the table, her eyes still distant, but there was a quiet resolve in her expression. "We'll figure this out," she said softly. Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. The fire in the hearth burned brightly, casting long shadows on the walls, and for a moment, everything felt still. But the silence was only temporary. He knew that soon, they would be forced to face whatever dangers were lurking just around the corner. They had no choice. They had already started down this path, and there was no turning back. But for now, they had this moment. They had this night. And in the quiet, Jake made a promise to himself that he would do whatever it took to protect her, to uncover the truth, and to keep the legacy hidden where it belonged, away from the people who would destroy everything to get their hands on it. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin as Jake and the girl sat in the stillness, the weight of the night's events hanging between them. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving only a faint glow in the dim room. Jake's mind was a whirlwind, the puzzle of the book and the key spinning faster than he could process. He had kept his promise to protect her, but now they were closer to the truth than ever before, and the danger was only growing. The girl had been quiet for most of the night, her eyes distant as she ran her fingers over the book. Jake knew she was processing it all, trying to make sense of the legacy that had been passed down to her, a legacy that had now entangled both of their lives. She looked up at him finally, her expression soft but determined. "Jake, what if we can't stop them? What if this legacy is too big for us to handle?" Her voice cracked with the weight of her fear, but Jake knew she wasn't asking for reassurance. She was asking for answers. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment. He hadn't expected to find himself in this position. This wasn't the life he had chosen, but it was the life that had found him. And now, with the girl beside him, he couldn't turn away. "We don't have to stop at all," Jake said, his voice steady. "But we can keep them from getting what they want. We can protect the people we care about. And we can make sure this legacy doesn't fall into the wrong hands." The girl didn't say anything at first, her gaze fixed on the book in her lap. After a long pause, she nodded. "I think we can do that," she said softly. Jake's heart tightened as he saw the resolve in her eyes. She wasn't just a scared kid anymore. She had changed, just like him. They had both been shaped by the darkness around them, and now they were ready to face whatever came next. They stood up together, the silence of the cabin pressing in on them. The air outside was still cold, but the sun was rising higher, casting a golden hue across the landscape. They had made it through the night, but they still had a long road ahead of them. Jake grabbed his jacket, his hand lingering on the door as he looked back at the girl. "We can't stay here for long. The people after us are going to be looking everywhere. We need to find a place to lay low and figure out what to do next." The girl nodded, her expression unreadable. She was ready, and so was Jake. Together, they walked out of the cabin, the weight of the book and the key still heavy between them. As they climbed onto the motorcycle, Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of determination. They weren't alone anymore. They were in this together, and they would keep fighting until they uncovered the truth. The road stretched ahead of them, winding through the quiet woods and into the unknown. They had no idea where the journey would take them, but they knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to stop until they had answers. As the motorcycle roared to life, the wind in their faces felt like a new beginning. The girl's grip tightened around his waist, and Jake could feel the connection between them, a bond forged in the chaos of their shared experience. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope. He wasn't alone, and neither was she. They had a future ahead of them, and they would face it together. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake knew that no matter what came next, they would face it head-on. They had already come too far to turn back now. The mystery of the key, the book, and the legacy was still unsolved, but they would find the answers. They would stop the people who were chasing them, and they would make sure the secrets they had uncovered stayed buried where they belonged, far from the hands of those who would use them for their own gain. The wind whipped past them as they sped down the road, the sound of the engine filling the silence. Jake glanced at the girl, her face determined, her eyes focused on the road ahead. She was ready for whatever came next, and so was he.